of his colleagues, in a way, of journalists and the media. And in the book we'll be discussing, he calls media often the stenographers of power. He devoted a book to the press and the Reagan presidency called On Bended Knee. So after nuclear issues, environmental issues, he also devoted a book on himself and his own profession. By now, you must have noticed that Mark Hertsgaard is indeed an engaged and critical and serious investigative author and journalist. But since in the book you will delve into issues about Protestantism, Calvinism, maybe interesting to us, Dutch, on culture, on culinary issues indeed, and relates these issues to geopolitical discussions, I shouldn't forget to mention an earlier book which shows his interest in these cultural, intellectual discussions as well, and for which he also dived into archives formerly closed to investigators. And I'm not talking about the German Democratic Republic, because in 1995 he published a widely acclaimed book, A Day in the Life, the music and artistry of the Beatles, the Fab Four, that is. Immediately after Hertsgaard's talk, Maarten Brands will take the floor. He was a professor of modern history of our University of Amsterdam and the directory of the Germany Institute, which was also a cooperation with the Universiteit van Amsterdam. And this institute actually was founded after some serious German-Dutch misunderstandings, where there was a postcard exchange where many Dutch people sent postcards to Helmut Kohl telling that they were really aroused by German discussion, German issues. Well, we won't be talking about Germany here, although Maarten Brands published many articles and books on German issues, but also on the Reagan administration. He wrote about the promotion of stability in Europe in an advisory commission for our government, by the way, on world economy, on transatlantic relations. And I'll give you just an impression about the skeptical, or in a way, skeptical outlook historian like Maarten Brands has, just by mentioning a few titles. His inaugural lecture in 1970 was simply The Unique America. But the skeptical outlook came somewhat later when he, for instance, published The Obsolescence of Almost All Theories of International Relations. So almost all theories are obsolete. Of course, we are very interested perhaps later to hear which theory of international relations he values. And his final lecture as the director of our Germany Institute was titled The Exploiters of the Inn, the Herberg, of Missed Opportunities, German Intellectuals and the Political Deficit. And finally, I want to mention his lecture he held here in the same aula in 1993, which was titled History Hits Back, about the overestimation of word and text and about the limits of tolerance. Well, if this was not a prophetic title, which title could be? But then I should mention that his enemy in that lecture were not Quran reading and over-tolerated terrorists, but postmodern philosophers and historians. But maybe in the discussion we can sketch out some differences between terrorism and postmodernism. Although, of course, after the two talks, we'll have some discussion at the table, and after that I'll be glad to hear your questions or remarks, and we'll answer them from the table. So perhaps if you're not interested in the relation between postmodernism and terrorism, we'll delve into other issues. But first I'd like to give the floor to Mark Hertsgaard, please.
Hello. I feel so comfortable here. It's a Lutheran church. I grew up in the Lutheran church. And to be back here in Amsterdam, I've come to Amsterdam many, many times over the years. It is without doubt the foreign city that I have visited the most often. I've been coming here since 20 years now. I will mention quickly that I came here under the auspices of something called the Transnational Institute, which is a organization that has offices over on Paulus Potterstraat. And they were the sister institute of where I began my career right after college at Johns Hopkins. I went to work at a place in Washington called the Institute for Policy Studies. And they had a sister institute here in Amsterdam called the Transnational Institute. So it was really here in Amsterdam that I wasn't the first foreign country I had visited, but it was certainly where I began my education about the rest of the world and how America relates to the rest of the world. I've never been in a Lutheran church in Amsterdam before, though, so this is it's nice, although a little strange, because it sort of takes me back to my childhood. I haven't been in a Lutheran church in quite a few years, but you know, you can't have spent 12 years in the Lutheran school system like I did and not have it touch you a little bit. So at some level, I feel very at home here, I guess. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for those nice introductions. And first, a very warm thank you to my publishers here in Holland, Cossee, and especially to Eva Cossee, who has been my publisher here for a number of books, not just the Earth Odyssey book, but also the Beatles book, and now this book. I'm deeply grateful to her and to her partner, Christoph Buchwald, who has done such a great job of bringing me here. Needless to say, to the John Adams Institute and to Monique for bringing me. It's a really great honor if you look at the kinds of people from America who've come here over the years. It's really quite a stellar list that you've accumulated. And it's nice, I think, because when you bring people here, like, say, John Irving, or Jared Diamond, who wrote the great book Guns, Germs, and Steel, and a whole host of others that she's too polite to mention, it's important because it shows you something that I keep saying now in my interviews here. America is a much bigger place than George W. Bush. We are 285 million people, and what you hear in your media about America tends to be George W. Bush. But it's a big country, and there are many of us who don't agree with Mr. Bush, and so I'm very grateful to Monique and to the John Adams Institute for showing you a little bit more of the diversity of America, which I think is one of our greatest strengths as a country. I hope you'll forgive me if I not avoid but delay discussion of the topic I'm sure we're going to talk about eventually tonight, which is Iraq. But I have now been on my book tour here in Europe for about a week, starting in London and now here in Holland and Belgium for the last 5 days. And I'd say about 80% of the questions I'm talking about with journalists are about Iraq. Obviously, it's very important, and we will get to that later in the whole war on terrorism. But I'd like to start, if I may, with something a little bit broader that I hope will inform our discussion about America. I notice here, and having come here for 20 years, and I notice in this trip that there is, understandably in my view, a lot of impatience and resentment and frustration among Europeans about America. And why is America doing what it does? And why doesn't America listen more to the rest of the world? And as I say, that's understandable, and anyone who reads my book will know that I am the last person who will be accused of apologizing for America. This book is not out yet in America. It comes out next month, and I guarantee you I will be attacked viciously for the criticisms I make of America. But I think it is very important for all of us to remember that, again, America is much more complicated than its mistakes. There is a lot more to America than where it goes wrong. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that here tonight to set the stage for our conversation. And needless to say, I'm very grateful to the professor to be joining me here tonight. We had a good conversation earlier tonight, and I look forward to our dialogue shortly. This book began as an outgrowth of having, as a reporter, spent much of the last 10 years traveling around the world and interviewing people about other topics, usually the environment and politics and occasionally the Beatles. And it was interesting. I've traveled in about 30 different countries as a reporter, in Africa, Western and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Russia, Asia, especially China, South America. I've had a great fortune to see many different parts of the human family and talk to many different people from all walks of life. Very impressive political leaders, Václav Havel, for example, Jacques Cousteau, business executives, including one who's here tonight, who is one of the sources, a Dutch business executive who's quoted in the new book. Happy to see him here tonight. But also illiterate peasants and starry-eyed teenagers and housewives and workers. And what I found as I traveled around the world is that people would always answer my questions about the environment, but it was often fairly dutiful answers. But as soon as they found out that you were from America, that is what they wanted to talk about. And they had many questions and many opinions, and overall an enormous curiosity about it. And as a result of that, I, over the years, began to think, it would be very interesting to do a book that tries to explain America to non-Americans. Because often non-Americans have the sharpest insights into the United States, and yet occasionally, if I may suggest, some of those insights are not always terribly informed. You may see the truth but not understand the reason beneath the truth. And so that was the idea with this book, was to try and explain America to the outside world. Now I'll tell you a little secret that I will not be saying in America, which is that this book was originally intended only for my foreign publishers. I did not expect this book to be published in America because, let's face it, America basically doesn't care about the rest of the world. And I feel this very directly as a journalist who is constantly trying to sell the American media stories about the rest of the world. And they say, oh, it's too complicated, it's far away. They don't know, Americans don't know much about the foreign world, and they don't care very much about the foreign world. So my intent and my plan when first thinking about this book, which was a semi-famous conversation now at the kitchen table of Eva and Christoph here in Amsterdam last summer, is where we thought about how this book would be. I thought I would only sell it to my foreign publishers because New York publishers would not be interested in the rest of the world. And indeed, in the first chapter of this book, I say that is the first inequality that distorts our relationship, which is that Americans, at least before September 11th, did not know or care very much about the rest of the world, whereas the rest of the world has little choice but to know and care about America, because America is in your face all the time. So I hoped in this book to try and explain America a little bit. Now, of course, September 11th changed that, and Americans learned the hard way, the very hard way, that what the rest of the world thinks does matter. And since then, we have, I think, paid a little bit more attention to what's going on beyond our borders, and I hope my book, in a very small way, may help Americans to understand that a little bit more, what outsiders think of us, because God knows we need some help. I think the single biggest lie that has been told to the American people in the last year is, in the words of a cover story in Newsweek magazine, why they hate us. Americans have been told that the world hates us. That's why September 11th happened. They hate us. They hate our love of freedom. President Bush just said this the other day. In a Labor Day speech, he said, this is why we have to go to war in Iraq. They hate us because we love freedom. Well, I'm not the president. I'm just a reporter. But I've had the good luck to go around and talk to a lot of people around the world, and what I find is they don't hate us. They don't hate the American people. They like the American people. It's our government. It's our military. And it's our corporations that sometimes make people, if not hate us, resent us. And that's a very, very important difference between America and Americans. The American people, who for the most part are liked overseas. You laugh at us sometimes, you think we're naive, that we're kind of childish, that we're uncultured, and there's some truth in that. But generally, people tend to like American people. It is the arrogance of American power. It is the cruelty of American foreign policy. It is the greed of American corporations that excites the anger overseas. And I think that's very important. It's also important to remember, I think, that the idea of America is very widely admired overseas. I think immediately of a man I knew in China, a man I interviewed in China about 5 years ago. He was a coal miner, lived out in the coal fields quite a ways west of Beijing. And I was going out there on my environmental research, and I wanted to see the coal mines and so forth of China. And the bus dropped us off, my interpreter and me, out there, and we went into this little restaurant, hole-in-the-wall restaurant. And here was this guy. I got to know him. He'd been running this restaurant ever since leaving the coal mines behind. He had been in the coal mines since he was 14, until one day he saw another coworker have his head crushed flat like a pancake by a runaway coal cart. And this gentleman, whose name was Mr. Ma, said, enough, I'm not going to work in the coal mines again. Came up, capitalism was just beginning in China. He decided to take his chances. And now, 10 years later, he had a little hole-in-the-wall restaurant. He had a little blue van that he used as a taxi. And we spent the rest of the day together. He was taking me to all his old coal mines. And a white face was very unusual in his region. But when he found out that I was not only white, but I was an American, his face lit up. He called his wife out of the kitchen where she was cooking. He said, come, you must see this is an American. And he started talking about me. I felt a little bit like I was a horse who was being sized up for sale and how much they were going to pay for me. And he said to me, I want to know the secrets of the market economy. He says, you in America, you've had the market economy for many years. In China, we don't have the market economy. I want to know the secrets. I want to be rich like you. So we spent the rest of the day traveling around and talking about many things, the market economy, coal, and the environment. Deng Xiaoping, was he alive or was he not alive? How could you tell? And he said, well, you can read between the lines in the Chinese press. Very interesting. And then that night, when he was in the dark, he was finally driving my interpreter and me back to town, to our hotel, he finally got around to the subject that really interested him, which was, of course, sex. China's very, very conservative about sex. And he evidently had heard that America was a little different, because he says to me, is it true in America men and women sleep together before marriage? I said, sometimes this happens. He said, have you done this? I said, perhaps. And then he said, could a married man, such as myself, can a married man do this? I said, it happens. Occasionally it happens. And I'll never forget, he was driving the car and he hit the steering wheel, and he said, I knew it. America is the most rich and it has the most fun. And then he dropped us off at our hotel 2 minutes later, and he insisted I give him a second business card, and he says, when I am rich, I'm going to come visit you in America without my wife. Now, obviously, Mr. Ma's vision of America is not so realistic, but it bespeaks the fascination that outsiders have with America. And I'll tell you one more quick story, again, about a man I met in my travels that talks not about just the fascination, but the admiration that non-Americans have for the idea of America. And this was in Cairo. This was in the Islamic Quarter of Cairo in June of 2001, 3 months before the attacks, at the time when Osama bin Laden's terrorists were already planning this. I was in Cairo, and I spent the morning interviewing a number of people, including, by the way, some retired terrorists, which is sort of an odd concept. But, you know, I guess, terrorists have to retire eventually, too. And these were 3 guys who were probably in their 60s, and they had nothing good to say about the United States. It was a fascist defender of Israel and a corrupter of the Arabic soul and so forth. And yet even they began to have fond memories of the Hollywood movies they had seen with Gregory Peck. Gregory Peck was very big for them. And then later that morning I went to see a man who was a cripple, about 51 years old, just down the street. And I said to him, same question I asked everyone in Egypt and in most of the countries. I said, what is the first thing you think of when I say United States of America? And he answered back in Arabic, freedom and democracy. I said, really? Everyone else I have asked this question to in Egypt has said Israel. And my interpreter translated, and the man replied, yes, that is because Egyptians disagree with America's policy towards Israel. And I agree with them about this. But I also know that American people have their own good minds and can think for themselves. And we know that some American people also disagree with this policy, and they have the opportunity to disagree. Very impressive. And then a truck came by us in these very narrow streets. A truck came by us, and we had to edge up against the wall. And as the truck went by, one of this man's younger friends started banging on the truck and yelling and throwing a fit. And the other friends sort of dragged him away, and they waved the truck on. And I looked at this guy, and he had actually shouted at me earlier when I declined his offer of a soda drink. And the man said to me, "Please, I'm sorry, but do not think badly of Amir. His mind was ruined in prison. He was a political activist here 20 years ago, and the government threw him in jail. He lived in a solitary confinement for 10 years, and when he came out, he was like this." He said, "I don't think this would happen in America. In America, you have the freedom to say what you want." I have found, whether it is Egypt or China or Russia, the countries around the world, especially those countries where freedom does not exist, have a genuine admiration for the freedoms that live in the United States. I think it's important to remember that. And I'm going to talk in my remaining minutes here about George Bush's attack on freedom in the United States. But it is important for those of us who do have criticisms of America, and especially America's foreign policy, and America's arrogance, and America's, let's face it, America's support for dictatorship. That government in Egypt is only in power because of American support and $2 billion of American aid every year. But the idea of America, the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, individual freedom, that is a very, very powerful idea, and it remains powerful in the minds of people throughout the world. And again, I beg you, do not confuse George W. Bush with America. He is a disgrace to that idea of America, the true purpose and source of American greatness. And it's ironic that a man like that in Egypt understands that better than the man sitting in the White House today. I say that because, as you well know from reading the newspapers, after September 11th, the Bush administration has essentially, in the name of patriotism, tried to shut down freedom in the United States. They passed something called the USA Patriot Act. Only Orwell could have dared to come up with a name like that for a law that, in effect, invites the government to become a police state in the United States of America. The USA Patriot Act was passed in October of 2001, and it was passed with almost no dissent in the United States Congress. The vote in the United States Senate was 98-1. In the House of Representatives, out of 435 members, less than 50 voted against this. This act gives the government the right to search my house without my knowledge. As we say, you can have a secret roommate now. Big Brother can be your secret roommate for 6 months. The government doesn't have to tell you that it's even looking in your house. It can search your mail, it can search your email, it can search your bank records, completely legally. George W. Bush, as president, on his sole authority, without review by the Congress or by the courts, can decide who is a terrorist and who faces a military court. The Department of Justice, the Attorney General, Mr. Ashcroft, is able to decide who is a terrorist, and in the name of anti-terrorism is able to keep people in jail without a trial, without a lawyer, indefinitely. He is able to decide who is a foreign combatant. Any of you, by the way, who travel now to America, Maarten and I were discussing this earlier, Maarten was in New York for a year last year, anyone who is not a United States citizen can now essentially be arrested. And for no better reason than that John Ashcroft thinks you should be arrested, thanks to the United States Patriot Act. There are 20 million non-citizens in the United States, people who live, work, raise children in the United States. Since the passage of the United States Patriot Act, all of those people overnight can be taken into jail. Now, they're not. That's not happening. Most of those 20 million people are living their lives. But the government has asserted that power. And in some cases, it is exercising that power. There are 1,200 at least detainees that the Bush administration says, these are terrorists, we need to question them. They have yet to release their names, what they are being charged for, much less to give them lawyers. This is very, very basic. This was the essence of what we fought King George of Britain about. No more secret trials, the right to self-defense, the right to non-self-incrimination. All of these things have been swept away in the 5 weeks after September 11th by the United States Patriot Act. It is a very black mark on our country that such an anti-democratic law was passed into existence. And I'm sorry to say that my colleagues in the American media did a terrible job of warning about the dangers of this bill when it mattered, that is, before it passed. There was no critical discussion of what was going to happen. However, as I said before, the United States system is based on very strong principles, and the idea of freedom is a very intoxicating idea, and once it is in a people, it is very difficult to root out quickly. And so I am very happy tonight and very hopeful tonight to say that there are signs of real resistance to this in the United States. Resistance to the USA Patriot Act, resistance to the Bush administration's attempt to make the war on terrorism into the next Cold War. In the Cold War, if you said things like I say about my government, you were called a communist. Now they call you a terrorist. But there are some of us who are fighting back, and I take great hope from that. I'll talk quickly about two of them. And one is a group that I have always been very fond of, which are the librarians of our country, the public library, one of the great democratic ideas that everyone should be able to read and have access to books. The USA Patriot Act says that libraries must tell the government what we read, that libraries must become secret police. Not only must they tell the government what someone is reading, they cannot tell the reader that they've told the government. They must become secret spies for the intelligence agencies. Well, God bless them, the librarians are saying no. Librarians are often laughed at in America because they tend to be sort of mousy people and quiet and all of that. But by God, they believe in the basic principles of the country, and they are standing up when a lot of the loudmouths are not standing up. And I, for one, really applaud them. They are a great example to the rest of us. Another group that is standing up, that is having much more effect immediately, surprisingly enough, is our court system, our judicial system. Famously, the United States has three branches of government: the executive, the president; the legislative, the Congress; and the judicial, the courts. There have been two very important court decisions in the last month that have slapped the Bush administration in the face about this and said, no, you cannot do this. One of them comes from a very secret court known as the intelligence, it's basically the court for the intelligence community, CIA, FBI, etc. And that was a wonderful decision because they let loose the fact that this FBI has lied in 75 separate cases where they said, we must arrest this man, he's a terrorist. The FBI lied to the CIA about it, lied to the rest of the Justice Department about it. This court has only had 2 rulings in the last 25 years. This was the second one. They're so secret most Americans don't know the court exists, and yet they said no to this. They are very conservative people on that court. They said no. Likewise, with the Federal Appeals Court came the next day, and they said, again to the Bush administration, those 1,200 people you call terrorists, those 1,200 detainees, no, you may not keep them without trial. You may not keep them without identifying them. You may not keep them without lawyers. And the judge, again, a Republican judge, had a wonderful line. He said, democracies die behind closed doors. Now that was a Republican who said that. And that, to me, again, gives me great hope for my country. I'm not a Republican, I'm not a conservative, but I appreciate the fact that they, like I, can look to the principles of our country and say, no, we believe in fair play, we believe in individual freedoms and individual rights. And I draw from that the conclusion that the spirit of democracy is not dead in the United States. We have a very deep foundation, and it is up to us as Americans to keep that spirit of democracy alive by believing that the victory of the bad guys is not inevitable. And in brief, in closing, I am going to suggest that that is the same for the foreign aspect of the war on terrorism. There is nothing inevitable about the United States attacking Iraq. Most of the discussion I hear here in Europe seems to take it for granted that Bush is going to attack Iraq no matter what. Maybe it's my American naivete or idealism. I don't believe that. I think that history is fluid, and that if we act like it's inevitable, we make sure it's inevitable. But just like back in the United States, and the librarians and the judges standing up and saying, no, this is not acceptable, even though it's maybe popular, I think that the same with the idea of war on Iraq. It is very important that people in Europe recognize that there is opposition to this war in the United States. Most of the American people do not support this war. Only 24% of the American people think we should attack Iraq unilaterally. And that is before any American soldiers have died. Okay? Again, don't confuse George Bush with America. We are a bigger place than that. But we need your help as Europeans. It is very valuable that, for example, the other day, Mr. Chirac spoke strongly against this, that Mr. Schroeder spoke strongly against this, whatever his political concerns. They are hardly the only leaders who have done this. Most of the world has said that they do not like the idea of war against Iraq. And sure, Mr. Bush says, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do it anyway. Don't be so sure. You make it harder for him when you say this is a bad idea. And just realize, again, there is opposition in the United States, not just from leftist troublemakers like me. The best and the strongest opposition in the United States is coming from within the Republican Party and even from within Mr. Bush's own family. I'm going to suggest to you tonight that Mr. Bush's father is against this war. And I say that because Mr. Bush's father's 2 top foreign policy advisors, the Secretary of State, Jim Baker, in 1991, and the former National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft. In the last month, both of those guys have written articles in the Washington Post and the New York Times saying, do not do this. Do not attack Iraq. It is against America's interests. Now, you can be sure Those men do not make that kind of an article, that kind of a public attack on the president without checking with the old man first. Okay? It's inconceivable that they would. That's the good news. The bad news is that they only take such an extreme, extraordinary public opposition because they realize they have lost the fight inside. They realize that there is a group of right-wing fundamentalists close to the president who are driving the policy. I'm referring, of course, to Vice President Cheney, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld in particular, those two, a number of others. And I think that the people around Bush Sr. realize that those guys have captured young Mr. Bush's mind, such as it is, and they have him focused on war against Iraq. But it's not going to be so easy. And if Europe speaks up, and if the rest of the Republican Party speaks up, I think it's very possible that this can be stopped. The single most persuasive voice to me on this has been from a senator from Nebraska. Keep your ears open for this man. He will be important. His name is Chuck Hager. He's a Republican, very conservative. I doubt he and I agree on very many public issues. But he was a Vietnam veteran. And he says, isn't it interesting that the people who most want to go to war right now know nothing about war? I have been in war. War is not a game. And these people who want to go to war all avoided war. Think about it. George W. Bush avoided combat. Like Bill Clinton, they dodged the draft. Dick Cheney, Mr. Macho, he's been working for the government all of his life, but somehow never found his way into the battlefield. Yet he's ready to send all these young men off to die. Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Defense Department, they've never faced foreign fire. They've never seen their buddy with his head blown off. And yet they're ready to go to war. Thank God there are senators like Chuck Hager, who again, although conservative, go deep into the country's true principles and say, this is not what America is about. So please do realize this is a fluid situation. America is bigger than its mistakes. We are wider than that. Our greatest poet, Walt Whitman, said this a long time ago. I contain multitudes. I contain multitudes. And we do. It is what makes us strong. It is what makes us a beautiful place. The diversity, the ethnic diversity, that we bring people from all over the world and we mix them together. And we find the best from everyone. And hopefully we try and share that with the rest of the world. That is what makes us strong. And I think if we return to that as a country, we have a great future. It is America that will decide whether anti-Americanism grows in the years ahead. If we continue to act like an arrogant empire, people will react in a predictable way. They will continue to be irritated. They will continue to be resentful. And very regrettably, there will be more September 11th. But I found in my reporting that actually there is an enormous reservoir of affection for Americans and the idea of America. And if America returns to its true roots and acts in accordance with our democratic principles, I deeply believe that the rest of the world will embrace us rather than reject us. So, I thank you very much for your attention, and I beg your involvement in the weeks and months to come in trying to help America move to its better half and not its lesser half. Thank you very much.
ladies and gentlemen. You have heard Mark's plea for an unbushed America. My task is now twofold. First, I should tell you that you should buy his interesting book, and what's even more important, you should read it. And second, that's a remarkable swapping of roles. As a European, I should try to be as positive as possible about the United States, about which you have heard, on the one hand, a very positive side, on the other hand, so much negative things. And on the other hand, I should be more critical about Europe than Mark, as an idealist, seems to be. The book is especially important in a country where we have more judging than knowledge about the object of our judging. And especially this is true about such a complex half a continent as the United States. Tourism is a very bad basis for knowledge in that sense. Mark clearly loves his great country, but, if I may say so, to keep the discussion short, as a good liberal, he is very critical of many aspects of his most powerful fatherland. Immediately should be added what Mark also writes about the US. Quote, America is modest about very little, but it is curiously reticent about its status as the mightiest empire in history. Mark obviously has lived rather long offshore. You have heard that he looked at the United States from all countries here. But not long enough in Europe to see its many weaknesses. In his book, he sometimes even idealizes Europe. Other American journalists who have traveled extensively in Europe are often far more critical. For instance, your colleague Joe Klein, who accepted an invitation of the British Guardian and traveled around in Europe. He reported about a Europe that is diagnosed as a bad case of Americanization. Quote, is it possible that Europe really has become just like America, but an America of the recent past, the 70s, to be precise, a period for which I harbor zero nostalgia. Much of this was handled over time in America. One wonders if Europe can make similar recovery. On both sides of the Atlantic, we do have great problems in getting the pictures of each other sharp. One of the causes is that globalization or internationalization, because that has also, as a side effect, a very strong parochialism, keeping the doors and the windows closed. Despite all our experiences last year in New York City, especially in Manhattan, I'm well prepared to say many positive things about the United States, especially to all those Europeans who seem these days to have a vested interest, an emotional, an ideological, or an otherwise interest in loudly criticizing the US. Criticizing the US fulfills in a powerless Europe indeed a very important political function, especially for the pseudo-EU Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chris Patten, who does not have any policy for the present world problems, but is very sharp in his criticism. For Mark, it still seems to be a question. This question is, do outsiders resent the concentration of American power? Do they compensate by making the US a scapegoat for their own shortcomings? The answer is, of course they do. And Europeans are especially well trained in keeping the scapegoats alive and kicking. European criticism in leftist and in rightist circles these days has become ritualized in the blame America first game. That game, by the way, is also widely played, even with greater fervor, in liberal America. The guilt feelings of many liberals are strong. Living a most spoiled life in such a rotten society, with the greatest inequality of the industrialized West, being a citizen of the most powerful nation in the world, that definitely is not an easy job. Most Europeans consider America no longer a suspect, but as a driving force behind most wrongdoings in this world. For them, the US seems to be the greatest danger for world peace. For my present role here, I got last year quite a bit of training when I was working in New York. Every morning at our institute, I heard my liberal colleagues relish the mischievous stupidities of the administration in Washington, faithfully commented upon by the New York Times. In New York, I could see how deeply split the two armies of American opinion makers are. And of course, liberals, despite everything, still do not want to hear anything negative about former President Clinton, ignoring the political continuity of the Clinton and Bush regimes in many respects. It did not all start with that stupid, ignorant Bush. American liberals are inclined to see in Europe a potential counterweight that could balance and discipline the US as a hyperpower. They will, however, have to wait till pigs start to fly before that political counterweight will exist in world politics, how desirable it may be. Let me admit right away that I'm perhaps too positive, as I got fascinated in New York by the great experiment of building a world society in that big city before and after September 11. It made me forget for a while about Europe's problems with immigrants. Mark rightly states, race, quote, race is America's enduring dilemma, but also its redemptive glory. And further on, quote, few nations boast the racial diversity found in the US. We are truly a rainbow nation. Not true of most European countries. At the same time, he writes, why are millions of people from around the world willing to do nearly anything to emigrate here? But then he adds, no wonder foreigners resent us, but they are also attracted by this country. This pull and push makes America so fascinating. This earlier criticism climbed up to the following statement, quote, politically, we live in a democracy that barely deserves the name. As you see, Mark commutes constantly between pride and disgust, and that may be tiring for the author, but it is fascinating for the reader who wants to know about the strength and the weaknesses of the US as a developing country in many respects, especially concerning environment issues. I've chosen a few themes for a more specific comment. The widening Atlantic, especially Europe's lack of understanding of what is going on in the US since September 11. My thesis about September 11 would be that, especially in the field of world relations, almost everything has drastically changed. The character of American hegemony, of the alliances, political reassessment of what is important, and what has become almost irrelevant. Mark does not agree with such a statement. I quote, "It is the same world as before, though it's not clear that we understand it any better. In my opinion, it is definitely not the same world." Remarkably, that the main theme of the present administration, and not only of them, not only of the Bush theme, the threat of terrible weapons, is hardly mentioned in the whole book. Those who criticize the US administration for mainly pursuing US national interest quite often overlook that there are many other aspects in that same policy that regard us as well. One thing is sure, the European lack of understanding concerning what has changed in America has strongly grown. Hence the new force of critique towards the US. Americans are shooting back now at Europe. It took a while, but now we hear the shots here as well. According to a well-known liberal commentator in one of the well-known monthlies, Walter Russell Mead, he wrote about Europe and about Europe's political judgment, quote, "Appeasement is Europe's second nature. Europeans never met a dictator, from Hitler to Saddam Hussein. They didn't think could be softened up by concessions." And Mark's colleague, Joe Klein, wrote about the EU. Here you have 15 tiny inbred societies, suffering all the genetic calamities, xenophobia, lassitude, rampant accordion playing. That inbreeding creates facing possibility of irrelevance in a world of massive numbers. The noisy lust of powerlessness characterizes opinion making in Europe these days. A harsh competition in shouting against those most stupid Americans. Mark hates American hypocrisy for good reasons, but without mentioning even the European competitors on that point. Hypocrisy is certainly not an American monopoly, Mark. In the US, arrogance of power may often go hand in hand with strong moralism. In Europe, powerlessness is often combined with a high-flown moralism of the ostriches. Europe, with its committee structure, is certainly not a partner in world politics for the US. It lacks any idea about world policy. Europe, at the same time, fears American power, on which it heavily is dependent, especially in moments of deep crisis, like in Bosnia in 1995. The US is far less dependent on Europe than Europe is on the US. The excellent French commentator Dominique Moisy reminded us recently again, quote, "Without the military superiority of the US, the world would be a much more dangerous place." How few Dutchmen would agree these days with this great French connoisseur of international politics, and certainly not a radical rightist. The EU is strong on ostrich policy, bury hand in sand policy, ignoring the great present dangers, trying to make itself small and invisible, hoping to avoid attention. There is a total lack of urgency concerning big international threats in this continent. What does Europe contribute in coping with the severe threats of the world? The present American administration, they are certainly not the only ones, does not believe, to put it mildly, that Europe is the continent where the action will come from. It's not the party of the future for them. Especially in our country, there's hardly any understanding for what's going on in present-day America, for that fundamental reassessment that has taken place there. The Netherlands seem mainly interested in scandals, and they are indeed numerous these days. And secretly it harbors the soothing, complacent idea that those bad things with accountants or Roman Catholic priests cannot happen here. The key words of the negative image of the US here are Kyoto International Criminal Court, Washington's attitude in general vis-à-vis the UN, poverty in the US, and above all, of course, the death penalty. This type of critique is, of course, not new, and many points are very well taken. But this critique has its cyclical boom. It will astonish many Dutch readers to read in Mark's book, very critical book, a statement like, quote, Reagan was certainly the most important president of the past 30 years, and arguably the most important since Franklin Roosevelt, end of quote. No regular reader of our beloved NRC Handelsblad is well prepared for such a positive judgment about a president who has been qualified in this quality paper as a moron, as een randdebiel. In their view, Mark should be a member of the conservative right, or perhaps even worse. And Bush is considered in our media to be worse than Reagan. A very important theme, of course, is the American policy vis-à-vis the Middle East, and especially concerning Israel and the Palestinians. Especially the remarkable fact that Arafat has been widely considered in Europe as a poor soul, while he is not only a master in double games, but also a major handicap for the development of a Palestinian state. I could not explain to my liberal colleagues in New York how these ideas could come about in Europe. And then almost the last point. The last point concerning Mark's book. The terrible American press. The worst media in the world. Mark is very pessimistic about them. A few quotes. The biggest political joke in America is that we have a liberal press. We do have a state-friendly press. Press subservience, self-censorship, stenographer of power. The Washington Press Corps functions as a palace court press. Superficiality and commercialism of American TV. Of course, very many points are right. Americans have, again quote, now have the worst of both worlds. A press that at best parrots the pronouncements of the powerful and at worst encourages people to be stupid with pseudo-news that illuminates nothing but the bottom line. On this point, I can only halfway agree with Mark. Bad newspapers, terrible television in America, of course. But it's like with the universities in the US and perhaps also in Europe. Some are very bad, others are the best in the world. Concerning international politics, I could find much more information about the world, all corners of the world, in the US than is available in Europe. And Mark, fortunately, does not know about our news programs on television. My God, you should watch our TV village news. Holland as the center of the universe. In our Manhattan neighborhood, almost everybody read the New York Times. And that liberal imperialism irritated me badly. I tried to tease my colleagues with Neues Deutschland, just one newspaper. Even the Washington Post didn't make it to my colleagues in New York. I preferred the variety of European papers next to the Times. After September 11, we could not get the international press. That was really a sense of isolation. I agree with Mark. The New York Times behaved as a cheerleader after September 11. That's not a function of a liberal newspaper. I found the Herald Tribune a relief compared with that verbose, self-righteous Times. The New York Times is certainly not a world paper it pretends to be, and Dutch journalists like Henk Hofland think it is. That paper does not inform its readers about the world, mainly about scandals outside of the US. As an idealist, Marx still believes in the good America that only has been victimized, suppressed, misled by bad economic and political forces and by bad media. He confesses still to believe in real democracy. In that sense, he is still a very good American, not a skeptical or even a cynical European who does not believe in the goodness of the people anymore. Therefore, you should read his book. It will not only help you to get a more complicated picture of the US, but you may also get redeemed of the European arrogance that we know better, or even that we are better.
Well, we have quite a confusing situation now. That is, Mark, being the American, thinks that most foreigners may think well of Americans, but have lots of criticism of America, and he warns us not to identify some people in America with America itself. And Maarten thinks, as a European, that most... Good, thank you. Maarten thinks most Europeans consider US as a main cause of most wrongdoings. Well, how does that coincide with your picture that most people like Mr. Ma really think that America has the most fun instead of being the cause of most wrongdoing?
Yeah, well, Mr. Ma certainly doesn't think that America is the cause of most wrongdoings. Can you hear me okay? I think this is not so good. Let's try and turn this up a little bit.
Yeah.
Is that better? Not really. You have to get close to it. We'll pretend we're in the radio studio here. Look, I don't want to be misunderstood here as thinking that America is the cause of most things. And let's also talk, I appreciated Martin's comments about Europe. I hope I don't idealize Europe. I think actually Europe and America have a lot to teach one another. Although I admire the social solidarity that is achieved by the social welfare state in Europe. And I admire it partly because it contrasts so sharply with the United States, where we have 40% of our children live in poverty. 40% of our children live in poverty. That is a disgrace in a country this rich. I admire, therefore, the fact that the social welfare system in Europe is stronger. However, I cannot help also noticing and hearing from Dutch and German and other people that too much of the social welfare state can be too much of a good thing, and that I think it does slow innovation. It does encourage people maybe not to work, maybe not to have quite as much ambition as would be good for the society. Every society has its pluses and minuses. You Dutch are famously involved with consensus decision-making. And as you well know, that has a lot of strengths, but it also is very frustrating at times. So in that sense, I hope that if America would maybe listen a little more, we would be in a position not only to teach, but to learn.
But do we have some things to teach? I mean, in your opinion, Europe is very good in shouting loud, but without having the power that America has, we are not being into conflicts where we should decide which course to go. But as Mark now pointed out, for instance, in interior affairs, perhaps in social welfare, these loudmouths have their business well in order. I beg your pardon? Oh, really? Okay.
You have to talk right
We have
into this.
to shout a lot. Ik neem aan dat het daar het volume eventueel. Ja, hij doet inderdaad helemaal niks. Okay, to keep it very short, if Mark says that perhaps in internal affairs Europe has some affairs better done than in America, how would you relate that to the loudmouth you were describing that the Europeans are in with respect to foreign affairs?
Now, first of all, at the moment, I mean, the relations between the US and Europe are at a very low. I mean, I didn't mention the war trade that's going on as well. Do not expect at the moment that, I mean, there will be a very open climate in the US politics vis-à-vis European ideas in this respect. I concentrated indeed on the political powerlessness. I mean, that is hardly understood, or at least stressed in the analysis we see about US-American relations. And also concerning solidarity, Mark. I mean, again, I know I cannot take New York for the US. New York City is not part of the US in many respects. But I mean, the perspective offered to immigrants in New York City is a different one from the one we do not offer here in that sense. And there we can learn quite a bit from the US still. How you organize a society that has a high number of newcomers and how to offer them a perspective that they are accepted in that society and that there is a future for them. I mean, that is one of the points we could take lessons from the US. But I'm not talking about lessons. I'm talking about a realistic relationship between the two. And that does not exist now.
I think that's right. I think America has a lot of things to offer the world, and the immigrant situation is one of them. I think part of the difference, again, is we're a very big country, and we have room for a lot of immigrants. And our country was settled by immigrants. We invited all of you there because we needed you in our factories. We needed you in our farms. Holland is obviously a very different situation. You have one of the highest population densities in the world, and one feels that when you're here, especially here in the streets of Amsterdam. It never amazes me how close you drive to one another. And yet you're very calm about it because you're used to living close together. So there's many different complexities here, and things like geography and history play a deep, deep role. I guess what I come back to, though, is that so often America does not seem to be very interested in that two-way street. We are much better at talking to people in the outside world than we are to listening. But, you know, last week the State Department in Washington had a conference about anti-Americanism and why the world doesn't like America. And typically, the State Department was putting on panels like this and telling people about America and why we're good and why you shouldn't think badly of us. When I was interviewed by the BBC in London last week, they said, what would be your advice to the Bush administration if you could tell them one thing? I said, I just have one word of advice. Listen. Try listening. We rarely listen with an open mind. And I think if we did, we would have a better exchange of views, and we could both learn. I think we both have things to teach one another, Americans and non-Americans.
But in your book, you stress often that the American government is not really representing the American people, and even, as we heard also in the comments of Maarten Brands, even the media is not giving ear to the American people. And just recently there was published an opinion poll amongst Europeans and Americans how they would think about leadership of respectively the American government, and Europeans said, I think more than 64% said, yes, we want the Americans to lead world politics, and more than 70% even thought, of the Americans, thought that Europe should take the lead. How would you think about that? That's quite a surprise, isn't it?
That is quite a surprise. We analyzed this, I think this same poll last night down in Antwerp. I was doing a similar event, and we were looking at that same poll. And most of the results in that poll found that Europeans and Americans, as general publics, had very similar ideas. Pretty much both publics believed that the United States should not unilaterally attack Iraq, for example. But this is a new one. I had not heard that. I don't want to dodge this, but I must say as a reporter, I would be very interested to know how that poll was taken, because it sounds a little suspicious to me.
If people had been sober when they answered.
So you're surprised as well. One of the issues that both of you somehow skipped, although you mention it in the book and you mentioned it also before, was the cultural or the influence of religion, and the odd way how religion influences American policy, American culture. So why is it that in a Lutheran church you didn't want to dwell into that topic?
Well, God forgive me. I suppose that was an oversight. Well, it's true, because you really cannot talk about America without talking about religion. It is impossible to understand our country, its history, its culture, its politics, and especially its economics, without talking about religion. There are two basic reasons that the country was founded many, many hundreds of years ago, and they were religion, famously the Puritans and the Pilgrims who came to America seeking religious freedom. But far greater in number were the people who came to America to make it rich. And that seems to be quite a contradiction. And so how is it, in fact I asked this question in my book, how is it that America can be the most scientifically advanced country in the world and yet also still debate whether we should teach evolution in our public schools? It is a bafflement, and I think, as is often the case, it was young Mr. de Tocqueville long ago who gave us the key to the problem. And he said it was precisely because Americans care above all about money that religion is so important. We need that religious belief to serve as a counterweight to our grab for the gold, to tell us that we are indeed still good people. And if you look historically, there was a certain psychological value to that, because let's remember, a lot of our early wealth in America was created by stealing the country from the original inhabitants, the Native Americans, and then bringing over Africans as slaves to work the plantations. That's where a lot of our wealth came from. And it's pretty hard to feel good about that. And yet, the religions and the formal religion let people tell themselves that as long as I go to church on Sunday and pray to God and I don't use cuss words and I'm faithful to my wife, I am a good Christian. And this continues to play out now. Just one last thought. It's no accident that there has not been, and I think never will be, an atheist elected as President of the United States. It is inconceivable that anyone in America could be elected who was not a Christian. Many of our politicians, including our presidents, are even born-again Christians. That is a more extreme form of Christian. Jimmy Carter was one. Bill Clinton was one. And when Clinton was recovering from the Lewinsky scandal, he used many of the Christian rituals of confession and seeking forgiveness and redemption. And that's part of the reason why he was eventually forgiven. And now, of course, we have a president whose favorite philosopher is Jesus Christ. You laugh, but in America, believe me, people don't laugh about that. And when we talk about going to Iraq, that is what is driving Mr. Bush, is this sense of good, capital G, versus evil, capital E. And it's the same thing that we thought of during the Cold War, fighting godless communism. This is all a battle that has very deep religious overtones. So I'm sorry that I left that out, and I'm glad you mentioned it.
Would that help us Europeans to grab more power and to be more powerful in political statements? Should we also become reborn or born-again Christians? Mr. Brands.
As a reborn pagan, I can answer that question objectively. I would broaden the subject somewhat. It's not only Christian religion. It's belief in belief. And there I can make the connection with the perspective for immigrants. That's the American myth. Every historian will say that's just mythology. But it happened to be so that there are lots of believers in that mythology, and then it gets real. Europe is the exception with its secularization. You asked the question quite well. I mean, industrialized country, modernized in many sense, and nevertheless, religion plays such an important role. Not only the Christian religion. It doesn't matter what God, any God is okay in that sense. That makes it for Europe rather difficult to understand quite a bit of the motivation of American politicians. In two respects. One, the religious drive, the mission. My God, we get nervous about it. And second, in combination with rhetoric we hate. I mean, especially Dutch are allergic for that type of rhetoric, the great words American politicians always use. But indeed, believe in belief. And you rightly stress in your book, Tocqueville in 1831, and you wrote it down in 1835. You all have that book at home, or you have it tomorrow, because it is still a classic where the major dilemmas, as you rightly said, are so well analyzed. A man who came there, a Frenchman, to inspect American prisons, he should do today. I mean, you are rather reticent on prisons in America in that sense. The worst in the world in that sense. I heard a famous American lawyer was asked, how about Guantanamo? He said, good. in case I would have the choice between Guantanamo being held in special prison over there, or here on Rikers Island, next to New York, I would know how to choose. There are lots of terrible things. But again, as you said, rightly so, believe in belief and the self-cleaning capacity in case a problem is declared to be a major problem. Something is going to happen. And then you can still use Winston Churchill's word that you may be sure that the Americans always choose the right strategy after they have tried all the other ones. But nevertheless, things are happening.
Right.
And then think of our committee structure, what they decided this weekend up there in Denmark about the dangers in the world. In case I would look for an insurance policy, I would know where to go and where not to go.
I think that's very important, the self-corrective aspect of America and the energy that comes from that. We make mistakes, but we do not dawdle. And when there is a problem, we have a certain optimism that we not only can solve it, but that it must be attacked. And I think that's a great strength, potentially. Sometimes we make mishaps. But that is, I think, one of the great contrasts with Europe. That is a strength of the United States.
My God, I tried to follow the hearings in the Senate about Enron and so on. Compare that to what's going on in our second chamber today. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the world of builders will not change drastically here. In the US, concerning the stock exchange and concerning a couple of big firms, there are a few things going to change. That's the difference.
Good, as promised, I will give you the opportunity to raise some questions. There is a question microphone over there. Yes, please. Could you go to the microphone, please? Please, there's a microphone over there.
Here.
Oh,
Here.
Totem pole of environmentalism, the Kyoto Treaty. And I would take issue with Mr. Hertsgaard on the way you presented it as a treaty between together who has created a big wrong and the rest of the American people. You can't have it both ways. Either you go to democracy and then get democratic government you deserve, and you do not. Moreover, in passing, you mentioned that when you criticize the Patriot Act, you said it's 99 1%, and in the House of Labor was the right to about 395 400. I mean, it didn't go 50. In the Iraq Act, it's the same thing. And I read in the New Republic that the author is pretty sure that when Mr. Bush would submit a military action to Congress, he would get the vote of Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Dawson, and the majority of the delegates as well. So I find it pretty unfair to do well as if the Bush administration brings harm on the country and the rest of the people and the rest of the political forces are helpless to keep.
thank you.
Look, I don't think that that the problem with American politics starts and stops with Mr. Bush. I wish it were that simple, but it's not. I do think, though, that the American political system has very, very little to do with the popular will. Right now, our electoral system is captured by big money and by an entrenched political class. In some ways, the worst problem about our elections is that the incumbents rig the rules so that they can't be challenged. It's almost as bad as the old Soviet Union. Right now, if you are a member of Congress, you have a greater chance of dying in office than of being defeated by a challenger from your own party. That's because it is so difficult to raise money. And that's because the people with money like to give it to the incumbent politicians. Because obviously an incumbent politician can write the laws that you want, can vote the way that you want, can prod the bureaucracy in the direction that you want. So, no, obviously the problem is a little bit broader than Mr. Bush. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I'm not sure that Mr. Bush would find it so easy to win a declaration of war against Iraq if he put it to the Congress. I invite him to do so. Let's let him do so. Let's let him honor the Constitution and give those people a chance to vote. The last time we went to war against Iraq, it was a very close vote 10 years ago. I'm not so sure that it'd be so simple. I think the New Republic is, as usual, serving as a perhaps willing mouthpiece for White House propaganda there, saying that, oh yes, we don't have to go to Congress because Congress is already with us. Well, okay. Well, we'll see. Let's have Mr. Bush obey the Constitution. That'd be a nice start.
Like his father did before the Gulf War.
Even though it wasn't a formal declaration of war, but at least there was a resolution, yeah.
But if I may add one thing, I mean, especially in this country, of course, the consent of the UN, especially of the Security Council, is considered to be extremely important. It is important. But we see now, even in a country like Holland, some change of opinion concerning that point, whether one veto in the Security Council can really stop developments in the world or international order in general. That's one point. And second, I can understand quite well the aversion of the American administration vis-à-vis the UN. I mean, they have in general had extremely bad experiences with that. I mean, being considered to be the most imperialistic country in the world, especially in the 70s and in the 80s. Recently still, that Human Rights Commission of the UN, where America was left out because countries like Sudan, highly democratic countries, of course, were against it. I mean, that's the second point. And that International Criminal Court, they know, of course, in case countries that are shouting for American intervention to help them out, and that's a very long list, not only in Africa, that the American administration says, we are not going to send any American soldier over to your desperate place when it is not absolutely sure that you will not get involved in this time of difficulty. And especially, I mean, the experiences in Belgium, with Belgian law, where all world criminals can be caught, isn't it? As Monsieur Michel himself said, we want to play the same Dutch game and get a higher moral standard. The US does not want to get involved in this type of political business called an international criminal court.
But don't you think the US, with that, gives a signal that it wants to distract itself from international treaties on human rights, etc.?
it is even worse. Because now, and that is the main thing, I mean, you could have read it yesterday evening in our beloved newspaper, the Handelsblad, which I recommended before, that article by Henry Kissinger. I mean, in former days, we had enemies. You could wait till they came. Now, the enemy is there before you know. What is the response to that? Wait and see till he attacks? Or, and then a terrible word comes out, a preemptive strike. And the US is now thinking along, the US administration is now thinking along that line. We have the obligation, nevertheless, what's going on with sovereignty of those states, to intervene in those places of which we are sure, others are sure, that something is prepared. And that is, of course, a new type of philosophy and an enormous blow to international law. I'm not sure how this will work out. And again, I mean, I'm on the side of Kissinger in that sense as well. You will not mind. I mean, you need allies in that type of thing. The American isolation on that point is bad. You cannot, not the US government can decide, this is a difficult place, we are going to attack. Nevertheless, what is going on